parents to let him take two of his sisters back to California with him because he said they'll have more opportunities in California. Well, that also included a husband for Aunt Margaret. So when she got married, a twin bed wasn't going to cover the bed, or a twin quilt. She needed it to be double size. So she wrote to her then 4 existing sisters and said, could you make me a panel to match my quilt, either for the side or the top or the bottom? So this is the only quilt that we know of that has my grandma's and my mom's and her 4 sisters, all of their work in the same quilt. Luckily, I inherited it because my cousin, who was the executor of her will, looked at all of the cousins and said, yeah, Georgiana knows more about quilts and will appreciate it more than anybody else, so he shipped it to me. I just got it this summer, so I did not know this pattern, but Diane looked it up for me, and that's called a wagon wheel. I'm sorry, water wheel. The next 3 are all on loan to us from Sherry Alloway. Nobody in her family quilts, but her husband's family did, and so these are all inherited through her husband's side of the family. His grandma Ida Horrocks is the one who made these. The title of this one is Grandma's Flower Garden, and they are pretty sure it was done in 1936 because Ida did it while she was expecting her first baby. This is one we don't know the title of because, as I said, Sherry's family doesn't quilt. We think it might be something related to tulips, but again, it was made by Grandma Ida Horrocks, and at the time she lived near Silex, Missouri.
Do you think any of those are feed sacks?
I don't think this one is. If you look at them carefully, they look more like the time period when there were calicos. The feed sacks would have been a lot looser weave, and these look too tight to have been feed sacks.
We have one later.
This one is a repurposed quilt. It's a Sunbonnet Sioux. This is where the original quilt finished, but it was getting worn out. So what they did was they put a new back on it, put a new border so it would hide the worn out edges of the original quilt, and then so they wouldn't lose all of the beautiful quilting, they knotted it instead of quilting it again. And it was originally made by Ida when she lived in Nebraska before she came to Missouri, and then she refurbished it in 1991 for her great-granddaughter as a baby gift. This one is ruching, which is French for gathering. It's owned by Mary Adele, and it was made by Eleanor Schlatzer Andres in about the 1900s. It was stored for decades in an old cedar chest, and that cedar chest was stored for 5 generations in a house in South St. Louis. It was a flat that was built in the mid-1800s. In 1970, the chest was moved to South St. Louis, and when Mary's mother passed away in 2016, they opened it and found this quilt, and they're pretty sure it was made by her great-grandmother. If you take a close look, the ruching around here is much smaller. You can see the rectangle, and then it's larger here, but then in the center, there's kind of a sunburst that starts really tiny and goes out. I would love to have seen how large this was before she started gathering it all together. The next one is on loan to us from Judy Van Arsdalen. It was made by her grandmother in the 1930s, and the title of it is Rail Fence. When Judy got married in 1972, her grandmother offered her $75 or a quilt. She chose the quilt. In 2012, she went to a quilt show and had it appraised. The appraiser dated it in the 1930s and valued the quilt at that time at $1,100. Judy cherishes the quilt and is very thankful that her grandma gave her a choice of a quilt.
Wow.
This one is loaned to us by Laura Burke, who is on my right. It was made by Cordy Franks, who was born in 1896 for her only daughter, Sarita Franks. Cordy and her husband were cotton farmers in Starksville, Mississippi. They didn't make a lot of money, and quilts were made for function, so you can tell that this one is well loved. Quilt was made from fabric scraps that were left over from her other sewing projects. If you look at the back, you can see that she used flour sacks from a local mill. The quilt was kept in the family for many years and eventually was passed to her only nephew, Ron Franks, who remembers playing out in the cotton fields. He was a professor of science at the University of Mississippi and held an endowed chair in that department. The next one is on loan to us from Cecilia Siebert. It was made by her mother, Cecilia Loyat. She calls it My Pastime and was made in the 1930s. The quilt was made all from scraps of dresses that Cecilia made for herself and her children. The next three are all owned by Teresa Daly and were made by Dorothy Daly. She calls this one the yellow quilt. Most of us would call it a 9-patch. It was made in 1981, and she remembers that this was always on the guest bed in Darren and Daryl's parents' house. This one has prairie points on it. I was raised in Iowa, but I moved to Massachusetts and Florida. No place had I ever seen prairie points until I came to Missouri. It must be a southern thing because Susan told us that when she lived in Texas, they also did prairie points there. So it's not every place that you see them. This one also is owned by Teresa Daly and made by Dorothy Daly. It's called Pink Applique Flowers. It was made in 1994. When Dorothy passed away in 1996, it was laid aside to be given to her granddaughter. She finished it the year that Darren and Teresa were married, and then when their daughter was born in 2000, it was waiting for her from her grandma. This one is also owned by Teresa Daly and made by Dorothy Daly. It's called Mauve with White Points. It was made in 1994. All three of these quilts were pieced by Dorothy Daly, a longtime member of the Wentzville Methodist Church and the Ladies Quilting Club. They helped her quilt all three of these quilts. Dorothy was the grandmother of Darren, Daryl, Kathy, Chuck, Vicki, and Angie, all graduates of the Wentzville High School. Darren was also a teacher at Wentzville High School, and this was made for him and his wife Teresa for their wedding. The next one is owned by Paula Gale and was made by Lois Campbell. It's called Variation on a 9-Patch. Lois Campbell was born in Joplin, Missouri in 1931. She loved making quilts for her family and friends and with the ladies of her church. Because of her skill as a quilter, her quilts and vintage linens were displayed every year at Silver Dollar City during their fall festival. This one is loaned to us by Paula Gale. Was made by Mrs. Westmeyer. Now I'm going to spell that for you because it's going to make a difference later. Westmeier, all one word. That was their last name. They were early residents of Wentzville and were neighbors to Carl Reiniger, who's also another prominent Wentzville citizen. They lived on what is today called West Meyer Road. Notice they split it in half and changed the spelling, but it was named in their honor. This quilt won a major ribbon at the 1966 Missouri State Fair. The flowers of the 48 states are loaned to us by Cleo Hamilton. This quilt was made by her three aunts, Agnes Whitty, Margaret Hamilton, and Mary Weisshire in the 1930s. Agnes, who I used to quilt with at St. Pat's, and she's long passed away, was only about 10 when they worked on this. She was the youngest of the three girls. They embroidered it, pieced it, quilted it to donate to their church to raffle off. They were very poor. It took all three of the girls scrounging all of their pennies to come up with the $1 that it took to buy a raffle on this quilt. And guess what? They won it back.
That's neat.
This one is owned by Peggy Meyer. Peggy waved to us. This was made by her dad, Doyle Cato. It's called an Irish chain variation. It was made in 1927. Peggy says, when my father was 13, he broke his ankle. My grandma decided that he needed a project, and so she taught him how to piece a quilt, which he completed. Now they don't know who quilted it, but her dad did piece it. Can you imagine a 13-year-old now?
No. If it was on a video, they probably.
The next three are owned by Kathy Burnham and Virginia Fisher. They were made by Emma Boland. This one is called Embroidery. It was made in 1955 as a wedding gift for Virginia and Carlos Fisher. I think this one is interesting because I'm sure when she embroidered this, these were all the same color. And it may just have been a different dye bat or something, but notice how some of them faded and the others, it looks like she used two different colors, but I will bet you she didn't. Because that wouldn't be a typical thing for somebody to do. This one's also owned by the same two ladies, also made by Emma Boland. It's called the Wedding Ring, and it was made in the 1940s. Kathy Burnham says, this was made by my grandma, Emma Boland, mother of Alfred Boland and Virginia Fisher. Virginia remembers her mother working on it when she was young, as a child, probably in the early 40s. It's well worn because, as Grandma said, if you didn't make a quilt, you didn't stay warm. The next one is also owned by Kathy Burnham and Virginia Fisher and made by Emma Boland. It's called a 9-patch. It was made in 1935. It was made for Virginia Fisher by her mother, Emma Boland. She had 2 boys when she was expecting her, and she must have been convinced she was having a girl because she made it pink. The quilt is 86 years old this month. Both of Virginia's daughters have come home from the hospital into this quilt, and they're hoping that every girl from here on does as well, because they have lots of boys, so the girls get to share that. And as Diane pointed out to us yesterday, this is the only quilt in this whole collection that somebody labeled. So ladies, if you are quilters, label those quilts. It helps people know their history, especially who made it and when. This one was given to Mrs. Morris by the nursery. Now we're asking if some of you are local and know more about the SCARC nursery than we do. All we know is it has names that some people recognize, like Wapahorse and Dubois and Beal Smith. And it has some dates on it, like 1974, 78, 09, that when they passed away. We think those might have been children at the nursery, but we don't know because we don't know anything about SCARC. So if you're familiar with that, let us know so we can share that with the owner so they know as well. The next one is definitely part of Wentzville's history. In the early 1900s until about 1925, flannel flags were offered as premiums in tobacco products. The flags were from all the nations of that time. They were a variety of sizes. Quilters were encouraged to collect the flags and sew them into quilts. They were mostly joined and tied rather than quilted. Patrick Nolan donated this flag quilt top to the Crossroads Arts Council in August of 2016. He didn't realize that the flags were from tobacco products. He had received the quilt top from his aunt, Shirley Rodriguez Payne, in about 2006, and she had received it from her best friend in Albuquerque, New Mexico. After Patrick gave the quilt top to the Crossroads Arts Council, they wanted to have it quilted. So Judy Hemmer and her sister Mary Tao offered to quilt the top. Judy researched the flags and found that they were tobacco flags from the early 1900s, but the fabric was not color fast, so the colors would run if they got wet. Judy hand quilted small crowns in the squares that joined the flags together, so there are no stitches in the flag squares, and that was completed in 2016. Shirley's friend hand-pieced 59 flags with backings on each flag and another flannel fabric of grays to make the quilt. When our show is over, now that the Historical Society has a museum, we're gonna give this to them so they can put it on display, so everybody who comes to the museum will be able to see part of Wentzville's history. And on that same note, if you've not seen it yet, Crossroads Arts Council has put a lot of murals in the downtown area. There's a tobacco mural on the side of the guitar shop, right in the center of town, that shows a lot of the history of tobacco in Wentzville. This one and the log cabin over on that table are owned by the same lady, and both of these she's willing to sell. This one has been appraised at $2,200. We're going to leave it so you can come look at it more closely. We learned that this is a technique called broidery. I had never heard that before, but there was a lady here yesterday who had gone to a quilt show in Ohio, and she said when you cut out floral things and then applique them, that's called broidery. So the border is all done that way, as are their spots in here. But what I want you to notice when you come up and look, she has double lines of quilting on the whole border. In here, there are lines that are only about 1/16 of an inch apart. We think that it was probably owned by somebody really rich, because for the time period, this is a huge quilt. It's over 100 inches square. And we normal people would have had smaller beds. Plus we wouldn't have had the time to do all of that stitching. So that one is for sale, as well as the log cabin that's over there. Now that's just a top, but that one is all silk, and it is more fragile than these because it's only a top, so we didn't want to keep turning it, so that's why it's laying out for display. But that one she's willing to sell for $1,100. So a couple of other notes, just to make sure that I have told you everything you need to know. On your program on the back, those are all the people that sponsored us to make this show possible. So if they are a local business, please support them if you can. We're always thankful to the Wentzville Community Club because they allow us to use the building for our show. If you have not seen them yet, over by Peggy there are 4 raffles. If you are a quilter, 2 of them are for gift certificates to Jackman's, which is in the city, and to All In Stitches, which is about 30 miles west of here on Highway 70. One of them is the Mizzou quilt that's sitting on the easel, and one is a basket with books and chocolate and coffees and all that sort of thing. Also, that entire area is a boutique, so if you want to get some of your Christmas shopping done early, that's an opportunity to do that. And I mentioned earlier the fact that we now have a gallery. If you were to walk out of this building and go over the top of the railroad tracks, that's where our gallery is. If you are a Wentzville citizen for a long time, you know where Old City Hall is. We are now in the bottom of Old City Hall, and the Wentzville Historical Society is in the top. So we have history and art all in one location. So come join us. The month of December, if you picked up one of the little red cards when you came in, we will have a holiday boutique. Everything in it will be created by one of our local artists. And you can see from this show, we have a lot of fabric artists, but you'll notice we have a category this year that's anything but fabric. So we have a woodworker back there. We have somebody who does a lot with scroll saws. So there are other things. We have lots of artists who paint, some in acrylic, some in oils. We have sculptors. If it isn't art, there's somebody in our group that does it. So if you want to come do your Christmas shopping and support the local artists, that would be great. Saturday morning, we'll present a Quilts of Valor at 9 o'clock to a local gentleman who served in the Vietnam War. If you are interested in learning more about Crossroads Arts Council, our next membership meeting is November 4th up on top of the hill at Green Lantern. Costs $30 to belong to the organization, but that gets you lots of perks. I want to thank all of our volunteers who helped hang the show, who are greeting you at the door, anybody who, because without you as guests, and without our volunteers and without our sponsors, this couldn't happen. So thanks to all of you. One last advertisement. If you are familiar with a Littlefoot, there's one over there next to the wall that's for sale. Basically, it's a table that sorry, I thought I had turned it off. It's a table that you can put your sewing machine on, which turns your sewing machine into a quilting machine. It originally retailed 2 years ago for $1,300. A friend of the council donated it to us because she got a larger one, and we're going to sell it for $650, which is half its original price. Everything's there, the table, the extra legs, the instructions manual, and everything. So if you're interested, let us know, or if you have a friend who might be interested, we would appreciate being able to sell it, and that money will go toward doing things like this in the future. Any questions or comments?